Okay, great. I see it here. Thank you.
There we go.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the 2 p.m. session at the 2023 LD4 conference. This session is the BIBFRAME Interoperability Group, BIG, Background and Current Work. We are joined by Melanie Wacker, who I'll introduce in just a moment. I want to briefly go over the conference links, which I'll also drop in the chat. I know you've seen these a few times already this week, and we'll see it again in the future, but just to remind you of our conference website, the code of conduct, our Twitter hashtag LD4_2023. We have Slack invites for both the general Slack and tech support. If you have any trouble accessing Slack, please do let us know. There were some hiccups today, but we've been able to add people manually if for some reason you aren't able to get in. And all of the sessions, with very few exception, are being live streamed and recorded to YouTube, and they can be viewed at the link located in the last bullet point here. So without further ado, please let me introduce Melanie Wacker, the head of digital resources, metadata, cataloging, and metadata services at Columbia University Libraries. Thank you so much. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Let me just see if this works. Should be okay. Now I just need to get the controls out of the way that I can actually start the slideshow. Okay, can you see that?
Back.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Oh,
So thanks again, Kelly, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. Some of you may have heard about BIG, the BIBFRAME Interoperability Group, in other venues, but we have not presented before here at the LD4 conference. So I will start with a quick overview on how and why BIG got started about a year ago. And then I will go into what we've accomplished so far, our current work, and where we are headed next. First of all, I want to point to the BIG wiki, which is actually a subpage on the wiki of the program for cooperative cataloging, the PCC. And this is because the group was initiated and originally organized by the PCC. However, the plan is that within an initial 2-year period, BIG will continue to operate independently. So the PCC helped us to get off the ground. So this space contains meeting agendas, the terms of reference, our current work plan, membership, and presentations. And I'm doing my best to keep it as up to date as possible. The origins of the BIBFRAME Interoperability Group go back to September of 2021, when the PCC organized a meeting to discuss exchange of BIBFRAME data between systems and implementations. Attendees represented a very broad group, which included national libraries, vendors, the LD4 community, the European BIBFRAME community, and others. And all agreed that the major challenge we faced were the different choices made in expressing the BIBFRAME ontology. And this does not mean that one group got it right and the other group got it wrong. It simply means that it's hard to exchange data if we don't know what the shape of that data is and which properties can we reliably expect. So in January of 2022, the PCC Policy Committee decided to start an international committee to help nail these things down a bit more. A lot of work had to be done before we could even get started. The terms of reference, including the charge, were finalized in April of last year, followed by the selection of the membership, which we finalized in June. And then in July, the group was able to hold its first virtual meeting. And selecting the membership was far more complicated than any of us expected. The planning group at first attempted to come up with its own list of implementers, and it never seemed quite complete. We always had the feeling we were forgetting somebody. So a call for membership was just placed on several listservs in the hope that implementers would then self-identify, which they did. We received a great number of applications, which was wonderful, but also made the selection more difficult again, because we did not want the group to become so large that conversation would be unmanageable. So we made the difficult decision to put some applicants on hold for a consultant group, which will be called upon to test and comment on the recommendations that BIG is developing right now. The membership is institution-based and includes standards bodies, libraries that have implemented BIBFRAME or are actively working towards implementation, and data hosting organizations. We also asked each institution to select one member and one alternate, but that distinction in real life has become really blurred, and by now everyone is just being treated as an equal member on the group. The current co-chairs are Ian Bigelow and myself, but my term is about to come to an end, and we are in the process of selecting the next co-chair. And this is the current membership. We have representation from Stanford University, the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, the Library of Congress, University of Alberta, OCLC Index Data, the National Library of Finland, and the National Library of Sweden, as well as University of California, Davis, Share VDE, Sinopia, and the University of Pennsylvania libraries. The initial planning group came up with the terms of reference, which includes information on governance and structure, how the meetings are conducted, and of course a charge which states that the group is working collaboratively on the development and maintenance of interoperable BIBFRAME data guidelines to support production level implementation, to address issues that limit interoperability, and that will inform the development of toolings and infrastructure. And it's really important to note because that we are not charged to work on the BIBFRAME ontology itself. So it is not a MARC advisory committee for BIBFRAME. And here are some of the work areas that the planning group proposed at the time. The word may has been used on purpose here to give BIG the ability to set its own priorities as needed. And so far, BIG has focused much of its work on the first two bullet points, and we will take a look at this in much more detail later in this presentation. And these are some additional suggested work areas, including examining and, if appropriate, make use of the work of other groups, particularly those that were charged during the first Linked Data Summit that was held 2021 by the Library of Congress, OCLC, Share VDE, and Stanford. And that is also how we started off, by surveying and incorporating work of these previous working groups, particularly the communication working group and the use case working group, followed by examining our own landscape on BIG. So the members shared information about their implementation, their pain points, and what their requirements, envisioned requirements are. So some of you may remember this. If you're on the BIBFRAME list or the European BIBFRAME list, we conducted an implementation survey, which was sent to the BIBFRAME list and other venues. And we had 11 responses, which we put in this table, and it was actually quite interesting. I mean, this was August 2022, so almost a year ago. But nevertheless, about half said that the model differed significantly in one way or another from BIBFRAME 2.0, which I thought was good to know, and they also told us in which ways. And at the time, 2.1 was the current version, but most were still using 2.0. Several implementers also shared documentation and sample data. BIG members also recorded which standards are used in their data besides BIBFRAME itself. While all were using the original RDA toolkit at the time, a number of local and national policies and vocabularies in various languages are also playing an important role. So BIG was also built on the work of yet another working group, the Strawperson working group. This was also an outcome of that first Linked Data Summit that I mentioned earlier. And while BIG was still being put together and got off the ground, that group worked on an interim exchange profile and validation tool based on the Sinopia PCC templates for monographs. The profile was encoded using Shackle, the shape constraint language, a language for describing and validating RDF graphs. And based on the Shackle, the group developed a validation prototype. And the BIG members tested the validation. It helped us identify areas where different implementation decisions had been made. For example, AdminMetadata just on the work, on the instance, or on both. Some had language tags on the literals, others didn't. Should we include both classes and subclasses, or do we expect systems to be subclass aware? Just some of the questions that were being raised. After co-organizing and participating in the second Linked Data Summit at the Library of Congress last November, BIG created an official 2023 work plan, which is helping us to keep on track. And you can find that on our wiki. In keeping with the previous work of the Strawperson group, we decided to utilize PCC data and standards as a starting point. It's just always easier to react to something than to start completely from scratch. We also decided to begin by looking at textual monographic work and then broaden out to other formats. Also, we want to ensure that our recommendations are readable by both technical staff as well by librarians. But if we can help it, we don't want to maintain different versions. So one subgroup is currently looking at producing a tabular format, possibly in DC-tab, and then use that to generate a shackle file that implementers can use to validate their data. I know several of our consultants are wondering when they will hear from us, hopefully very soon, when we have the first draft of the recommendations available. So I just mentioned DC-tab, which stands for DC Tabular Application Profile. And that's a simple model that can be used to define a profile. These are the column headers those are the 12 elements that are outlined in the DC-tab documentation. And at the end of the presentation is also a link to it. And most of them are optional. We're still looking into this, but it is possible that it may be it's too simple. We'll see if we can apply it. The jury is still out. In order to populate our application profile, we have to agree on the core or required properties. So we needed something to test each property against, but the use cases that other working groups had come up with were just really, really detailed and too specific for this purpose. So we developed these 4 very broad use cases, if you can even call it that, with accompanying guiding principle to help us evaluate the properties and classes in light of what are the absolute minimum requirements for international BIBFRAME data exchange. What do we absolutely need and why? As I mentioned earlier, just like the Strawperson group, BIG started off with the PCC Sinopia template for monographic textual work. And hence the column header referencing Sinopia that you see there. It does not mean that we're focusing on Sinopia, it just means that we didn't update that column header. And please note that this is just a small snippet of the entire data, just an example. So true, there on the required column, means it absolutely has to be in the data or else your data will not validate. However, and that is an issue that we were discussing just in yesterday's big call, false could mean all kinds of things. It doesn't mean don't use it. It just means, it could mean it's completely optional to a nice to have, or even it's really, really important and it should be required, but we cannot require it because the value may be unknown. So for example, obviously, if a work has a contributor, we want people to include that fact, but we cannot make it required. So we cannot mark it true because we may not always know who the contributor is. Another example is BIBFRAME content. It was required in a required property in the PCC profile that assumes that this is new cataloging using RDA. But in legacy data, particularly when it's international in scope, we realized that this assumption cannot safely be made. However, the information, if the work record is a text, for example, the book, or the spoken work, let's say the audiobook, is critical for identification. So yesterday we were discussing proposed solutions, which may include to instead rely on the broader work class, which at least would tell you if it's text or audio, or a recommendation that one has to include at least one of the two. But next call, we will have to decide which way we want to go. Currently, BIG is also discussing how to make the distinction between the different meanings of false more clearly and how to handle this in the validation process or in the documentation and in the documentation. So maybe false with an asterisk pointing to an editorial note, or change the terminology of false to something more meaningful to differentiate between the various definitions. And how to validate something this complex is also an issue. Essentially, there need to be 2 levels of validation at least. Users validating the data should still be able to validate the shape of properties even if those are not marked as absolutely required. But we also want to make sure that all properties that are required are present. So the group is discussing different levels of severity that may be indicated by the error messages. So for example, a message indicating the validation failed would be maybe one of the required properties is missing, versus generating simply a warning indicating that something is missing that should be included if available, or maybe something is amiss that is more of a best practice issue. One of the few truly required elements identified so far is the work title. Testing it against our high-level use cases, it's absolutely necessary for most tasks, identification, data reuse, and discovery. Of course, the devil's in the details as usual. Now that we decided we need a work title, we have to determine which shape or shapes are acceptable, because a title can be encoded in a number of different ways. We collected sample data from big members, and doing the survey, others have also sent us sample data, and we will see if there's an agreement or at least a preference. Even though admin metadata on the work level is somewhat of a holdover from the record-based environment, we decided that we cannot live completely without at this point when validating against our high-level use cases. It's definitely required for data quality evaluation. We need to know something about the data that we are getting from others. So it's required, but which part of admin metadata is required exactly? So a subgroup reviewed the properties that could be included in admin metadata. So far, there are only two that all agreed are absolutely required: the data creation date and the assigner, the cataloging institution. Again, there are a lot of details to be worked out once we really start going into the details here. So we discovered we had definite definition of what the creation date actually represents. So is it, especially if it comes the difference between an individual institution and a data aggregator. So for me, if I create a description that the data do that would be the creation date. But for an aggregator, it could be the day that the data was added to the system, or maybe the creation date when various descriptions of the same work were merged into one description. So there are a number of definitions that are possible. There are also different practices we discovered in how many instances of different admin metadata should be created. In some examples, there's one set of admin metadata that includes everything, and if there's a change date that gets added, or another approach where every time a change happens to the description, a new set of admin metadata is being added to it. So as you can see, there is still a lot to be decided on after that first high-level pass. A new subgroup is now forming to work on data modeling. And with that, I mean analyzing our sample data to determine the preferred shapes, not modeling from scratch. We will get back to many of the questions that were raised earlier when we initially compared our data using the validator built by the Strawperson group. And once we're done with the BIBFRAME work, we will do the same for the instance. And then we will encode our decisions in tabular form and hopefully, fingers crossed, be able to generate a shackle file from that for data validation. There will need to be additional best practice documentation for recommendations that are more complicated than the fairly straightforward validation logic would be. And last but not least, we will bring in the consolidation, our consultants into this process to give us feedback. So these are the references that you can look at later if you're interested on topics that I mentioned throughout the presentation. And of course, you can find the slides on Scheduler and on the PCC Big Wiki. Thank you to all the big members who contributed to the slides. And now we can take questions.
So if you have questions, feel free to post them to the Slack, or if you'd like to raise your hand, that works as well.
For now, stop sharing. Any questions at all? Ideas, thoughts, comments? We take it all.
I do see some folks typing in the Slack, maybe while their questions are coming to the surface. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the validation process. Shackle is new to me, so any extra thoughts would be much appreciated. Thank you again. It was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, so Shackle is constraint language. The first time I encountered it was when I was part of the linked data for libraries project, and we validated our AdminMetadata ontology using, basically we were encoding our application profile using Shackle, which is a little bit of a different application. And this tool that was created using this profile by the Strawperson group, so you can upload your BIBFRAME RDF, and then it would come back with a number of errors and on various severities. So yeah, sometimes it's like, this is missing, this is. I tested it actually with mods data that was converted to BIBFRAME. So that of course brought back all kinds of errors because that application profile was based on PCC data for monographs. But it was still very interesting, and so I think it will be very useful.
Thank you. Okay, we have some comments here. Dorothy's letting us know. You can think about Shackle as XML schema for linked data. It's more like relaxing, but possibly a useful way to think about it, a tool for defining what you'd expect out of a batch of linked data and expecting the computer to validate that. Thank you. We have a question from Zoe Dobbs that says, have you considered ways to handle data that will inevitably not conform to the shape? Or do we just have to accept that some data will be lost by ensuring interoperability on select properties? And she says she hopes she's understanding correctly.
Yes, you are understanding correctly, and we have talked about it. We haven't made a final decision on it, and I see a number of big members here on the call, so feel free to speak up if I'm misremembering. But yes, the subject has come up. Also, it's not just not conforming, there are also other ontologies. So, linked data is generally open, so there may be, people may be extending BIBFRAME. We are looking at BIBFRAME proper, but there are, local extensions, there are approved extensions, and we don't want to necessarily invalidate any of that. It's more to, the idea is more to validate that what you have has the core.
Thank you. Laura Ackerman asks, for the big discussion, do you envision having levels of requirements for BIBFRAME similar to MARC minimal and full?
Yes, funny you should mention that. We just looked at that yesterday. And again, me having the MARC background, I was reminded of the MARC levels of adoption that some of you may remember from way back. So, we were talking about having maybe like 3 levels of adoptions or requirement that people could follow.
Zoe's adding on, saying, I realize I should have asked about BIBFRAME extensions, and it sounds like you mostly answered that. So I don't know if you have anything else to add or.
Yeah, and we decided it's not going to be part of the core profile because you can't make that really required. And even the LC extension it's also somewhat fluid to test things out, so we can't really rely on it. We talked about that, but so we, our profile is going to be built on BIBFRAME itself. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be using anything else. And thank you, Jim, for also posting the Shackle links into the Slack.
Yes, thanks, Jim. I bookmarked all of them. I have so many links already from the conference. This is great.
Yes, there's a comment from Zoe. Maybe maintainers of extension should be thinking about creating their own shared validation, and that's a good idea. And as I said, we did that back then for the art and rare materials extension, but it was more, yeah, as I said, it was more for encoding our profile than for strict validation.
Unfortunately, I have to jump off at this point and jumpstart the next session, but please feel free to continue for the next 3 minutes. And thank you again, Melanie, for everything.
Sure thing.
Bella.
Right, I don't. There will be many extensions of BIBFRAME. We just need to map them in the shared shape that the data would be more interoperable. Is one comment, yes. We have 2 more minutes. Any other comments or questions? If you have any other questions afterwards, you can always feel free to email me or put it later in the Slack. I'll be monitoring that. All right, if there aren't any more questions, then thank you very much for attending. Thank you all.